Did you ever wonder if there was a time when your decision to marry or not to marry could lead to public ridicule or even cost you money? What if the very books and plays everyone enjoyed were filled with characters designed to make unmarried women seem like figures of pity or scorn? Could your health, your social life, and even your financial security be dictated by whether or not you wore a wedding ring? Prepare to explore some truly startling historical practices that once aimed to shape women's lives by shaming singleness. These are documented facts from bygone eras, painting a vivid picture of societal pressures you might find hard to believe. Number 10. Paying the price. When being unmarried hit your wallet. Imagine a world where your marital status directly influenced your bank balance, not because of shared household expenses, but due to actual government policies or deeply ingrained economic structures. For unmarried women in various historical periods, this was not a hypothetical scenario. The pressure to marry was not just social. It often carried significant financial weight, making single life an economically challenging path. While direct taxes, labeled explicitly as spinster taxes, were not as widespread or consistently implemented as taxes on bachelors, the financial disadvantages faced by unmarried women were numerous and ample, effectively creating a penalty for remaining single. In some regions and times, lawmakers did indeed turn their attention to the unmarried. For instance, during the late 17th century in England, the Marriage Duty Act of 1695 was introduced. While this act imposed taxes on births, marriages, and burials, it also included taxes on bachelors and childless widowers over the age of 25. The explicit aim was often to encourage marriage and childbirth, seen as beneficial to the state. Though not always directly taxing spinsters, such measures created an environment where marriage was fiscally infamized for men. This in turn intensified the societal expectation for women to marry, as a man remaining single and paying extra taxes could be seen as a burden his family, including potential female relatives, might feel. Beyond direct taxation, attempts the economic landscape for unmarried women was often inherently punitive. For centuries, opportunities for women to earn a substantial independent living were severely restricted. Most professions were closed to them, and the few jobs available, such as domestic service, governess work, or factory labor in later periods, were typically low paid. An unmarried woman without family wealth was therefore in a precarious position. She might have to rely on the charity of relatives, often living as a dependent in their households, a situation that could come with its own set of social costs and a lack of autonomy. This economic dependency made marriage appear not just as a social norm, but as a necessary route to financial security for many. The choice to remain single was, for many, not a choice at all, but a path to potential poverty. Inheritance laws also frequently disadvantaged unmarried daughters compared to sons or even married daughters. In many societies, property and wealth were traditionally passed down male lines. While a married daughter might benefit from a dowry or her husband's inheritance, an unmarried daughter could find herself with little to her name, especially if her father's estate was modest. Even if she did inherit, societal norms might make it difficult for her to manage her own financial affairs effectively without male assistance or oversight. She might be seen as an easy target for exploitation or deemed incapable of handling significant assets on her own. Furthermore, the social expectation was that an unmarried woman should ideally be supported by her family. If her immediate family was unable or unwilling to do so, her situation could become dire. Almshouses or poor relief were options, but these carried a heavy social stigma. The lack of a robust social safety net for single women, combined with limited earning potential, meant that the cost of being unmarried was not just monetary, but also involved a loss of status, independence, and security. The subtle and not so subtle financial pressures all steered women toward matrimony, framing it as the most viable, if not the only, path to a stable life. The very structure of the economy and legal systems in many past societies created a situation where remaining single was an uphill financial battle for women, a constant reminder of their perceived deviation from the norm. This continuous financial vulnerability served as a powerful, if indirect, shaming tactic, making the single state appear undesirable and unsustainable. Number 9. The public spectacle. Parades that mocked unmarried women. Imagine your most private life, particularly your unmarried status, becoming the subject of a loud, boisterous, and deeply humiliating public parade right outside your home. This was the reality for some individuals in past centuries through rituals known as charivaris or skimmingtons. While these noisy demonstrations targeted various perceived social transgressions such as adultery, mismatched marriages where one partner was much older, or domestic disputes, unmarried individuals, particularly older spinsters or bachelors, deemed to have waited too long, could also find themselves the unwilling stars of these mocking spectacles. These events were a form of community-enforced social control, designed to shame individuals into conforming to societal expectations, including the expectation of timely marriage. A charivari, common in parts of Europe and North America from the medieval period up into the 19th century and sometimes even later, was a cacophonous affair. Participants, often young men from the community, would gather at night outside the home of their target. They would be armed with pots, pans, horns, bells, and anything else that could make a racket. They would shout, sing ribald songs, and perform crude skits, all designed to draw maximum attention to the person being shamed. Effigies were often a central part of these displays. For an unmarried woman deemed to be past the proper age for marriage, an effigy might depict her in an unflattering way, perhaps alongside an equally unflattering effigy of a local bachelor, or even with symbols suggesting loneliness or desperation. Content of the mockery was specific and cutting. Songs might list her perceived faults, her age, or her lack of suitors. Crowd might make loud pronouncements about her single status, perhaps suggesting she was too choosy, too shrewish, or simply undesirable. The noise itself was intended to be inescapable, ensuring that not only the target, but also the entire neighborhood was aware of the community's disapproval. These events could last for several nights in a row, relentlessly hounding the individual until they were sufficiently humiliated, or in some cases, until they paid the mockers a sum of money or provided them with food and drink to make them go away. Underlying message of such a public shaming was clear. You have violated a community norm, and you will be publicly ostracized until you conform or are seen to atone. For an unmarried woman, the charivari served as a brutal reminder that her personal life was considered public business, and that her failure to marry was seen not just as a personal choice, but as a social failing. The psychological impact of such an experience must have been devastating. To be singled out, to have your neighbors and acquaintances participate in or witness your public humiliation would have been deeply isolating and distressing. While charivaris targeting spinsters specifically might have been less common than those aimed at other social deviants, the threat was always there, particularly in smaller, close-knit communities where everyone knew each other's business. The very existence of such a custom reinforced the idea that remaining unmarried beyond a certain point was abnormal and subject to ridicule. It was a raw and visceral form of social pressure, using shame as a tool to enforce conformity. Community took it upon itself to regulate behavior, and marriage was high on the list of expected life events. The skimmington, or charivari, was a folk justice system in action, and for unmarried women who became its targets, it was a terrifying and degrading ordeal, a public spectacle designed to highlight their perceived failure to fulfill a key societal role. The memory of such an event, or even the fear of it, would have loomed large adding another layer of anxiety to the experience of being single in a world that prized marriage above almost all else for women. Number 8. Blamed and shamed when your health was tied to your marital status. Consider a visit to a doctor where, instead of focusing solely on your physical symptoms, your marital status became a central point of diagnosis and treatment. For centuries, particularly from the early modern period through the 19th and even into the early 20th century, the medical establishment frequently linked a woman's health, both physical and mental, directly to her marital and reproductive status. Unmarried women, or spinsters as they were often called, were sometimes told that their various ailments stemmed from their lack of marriage and, by implication, their presumed celibacy. This medicalization of singleness served as another powerful and often deeply distressing shaming tactic. One of the most infamous diagnoses historically applied to women, and often linked to their unmarried or childless state, was hysteria. Derived from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus, this catch-all term was used to explain a vast array of symptoms in women, including anxiety, fainting, nervousness, irritability, insomnia, fluid retention, shortness of breath, and loss of appetite. Medical theories, some dating back to ancient Greece, proposed that the uterus, if not fulfilling its natural purpose of childbearing, could wander through the body, causing these diverse problems. While married women could also be diagnosed with hysteria, unmarried women were often considered particularly susceptible. Their bodies were, in the view of some medical men, unfulfilled and therefore prone to disorder. Treatments for hysteria varied. Sometimes, marriage itself was prescribed as the cure. Doctors might advise the families of unmarried female patients that finding a husband was the best remedy for her perplexing symptoms. This advice placed enormous pressure on the woman and her family, reinforcing the idea that her health and well-being were contingent upon matrimony. Other treatments could include bed rest, bland diets, hydrotherapy, or in some cases, more invasive procedures. The infamous pelvic massage, performed by physicians to induce hysterical paroxysm, what was actually orgasm, was another prescribed treatment, based on the idea that sexual release assumed to be absent in unmarried women was necessary for health. Beyond hysteria, other health concerns in unmarried women were sometimes attributed to their single state. Menstrual irregularities, headaches, melancholy, depression, and digestive issues could all be framed by some practitioners as consequences of a life without marriage and motherhood. The underlying assumption was often that a woman's body was designed primarily for reproduction, and that to deviate from this path was to invite illness. This perspective ignored other potential causes for women's health problems, such as poor nutrition, restrictive clothing like corsets, lack of exercise, infectious diseases, or the very real stresses of living in societies that offered them limited autonomy and opportunities. This medical pathologizing of singleness had several damaging effects. It could lead to misdiagnosis and inadequate treatment for genuine medical conditions. It also reinforced societal prejudices against unmarried women, portraying them as inherently unstable or unhealthy simply because of their marital status. Furthermore, it could cause immense personal anxiety and self-doubt for unmarried women who might internalize the idea that their bodies were somehow failing or abnormal. To be told by a figure of authority, such as a doctor, that your suffering was a direct result of your singleness was a profound form of shaming, suggesting that your personal choices or circumstances were making you sick. It was a powerful way to encourage conformity to the ideal of marriage, using the fear of ill health and the authority of medical science as tools of persuasion. The message was clear. To be healthy and normal, a woman needed to be a wife and mother. Number 7. Words as weapons. The stinging nicknames for unmarried women. Imagine living in a society where the very words used to describe you simply because you were not married were loaded with negative connotations, pity, or even scorn. Language is a powerful tool, and throughout history the terms applied to unmarried women often served to diminish their status, caricature their personalities, and reinforce the idea that their singleness was a deficiency. These labels, ranging from the seemingly neutral to the overtly derogatory, became a constant, subtle, and sometimes not-so-subtle form of shaming. The word spinster itself, now often seen as archaic or reclaimed by some, originally had a practical, neutral meaning. It simply denoted a woman who spun thread or yarn for a living, a common occupation for unmarried women who needed to support themselves. However, over time, as marriage became increasingly cemented as the expected and ideal state for women, spinster began to acquire negative association. By the 17th and 18th centuries, it was increasingly used to describe an unmarried woman, particularly one considered to be past the usual marrying age, and often carried implications of being unwanted, unfulfilled, or somehow inadequate. Legal documents would formally use spinster to denote an unmarried woman, but in common parlance, its emotional weight shifted. Beyond spinster, a host of other more pointed terms emerged. Old maid became a particularly prevalent and damaging epithet. This phrase conjured images of a woman left behind, withered, and often embittered by her lack of a husband. Popular culture, including literature, plays, and later, cartoons and early films, frequently featured the old maid as a stock character. She was often portrayed as fussy, eccentric, gossipy, prone to meddling, overly fond of cats, and secretly pining for male attention, or conversely, as a man-hater. These caricatures, while sometimes played for comedic effect, served to trivialize the lives of unmarried women and present them as objects of either ridicule or pity. Other terms like thornback were even harsher. A thornback is a type of rayfish covered in sharp spines, and the term, when applied to an older unmarried woman, suggested she was prickly, difficult, and unapproachable. It was a deeply unflattering comparison, implying an unpleasant disposition supposedly brought on or exacerbated by her unmarried state. Such language contributed to a social environment where unmarried women might feel constantly judged and devalued. The power of these words lay in their everyday usage. They were woven into conversations, jokes, proverbs, and cautionary tales told to young girls. Hearing these terms repeatedly could shape a woman's self-perception and her fears about the future if she did not marry. Created a social script where being an old maid was something to be avoided at all costs. The very act of naming an unmarried woman with one of these labels was an act of categorization, placing her outside the normal and desirable category of wife. This verbal shaming was not always overt aggression. It could be subtle, embedded in well-meaning but pitying remarks from family or acquaintances, or in the gentle teasing that nonetheless carried a sting. Cumulative effect of this linguistic environment was to reinforce the societal hierarchy that placed married women above unmarried ones. It made singleness appear not as a valid life choice or circumstance, but as a state of lack, a problem, or a personal failing. These words became weapons, subtly and persistently eroding the dignity and status of women who, for whatever reason, did not marry, making their journey through life just that little bit harder, their social standing a little more precarious, simply because of the labels society chose to attach to them. Number 6. Trapped by duty. The unpaid caregiver role. Imagine a life where your personal aspirations, your desire for independence, or even your own family were indefinitely postponed or entirely sacrificed because your marital status made you the default caregiver for others. For many unmarried women throughout history, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, remaining single often meant being relegated to the role of the maiden aunt, or the dutiful unmarried daughter, expected to provide unpaid care for aging parents, sick relatives, or the children of her married siblings. While acts of care can be born of love and genuine desire, this expectation often became an inescapable trap, a form of shaming that implied an unmarried woman's time and energy were less valuable and more expendable than those of her married counterparts. In societies where a woman's primary role was seen as wife and mother, an unmarried woman was often perceived as having no proper sphere of her own. Her lack of a husband and children could be interpreted as meaning she had ample free time and fewer personal responsibilities. Consequently, when illness struck a family member, or when aging parents required assistance, or when a married sister needed help with her large brood of children, all eyes often turned to the unmarried daughter or sister. It was an unspoken yet powerful assumption that she would be the one to step in, regardless of her own wishes, plans, or even her own need to earn a living. This role was frequently romanticized in literature and social discourse. The devoted aunt, who selflessly dedicated her life to her nieces and nephews, or the dutiful daughter, who tenderly cared for her elderly parents, was often portrayed as saintly and self-sacrificing. However, beneath this veneer of familial piety often lay a reality of limited choices and significant personal cost. The unmarried woman who took on these caregiving responsibilities frequently did so at the expense of her own opportunities for education, career development, social life, or even the possibility of her own marriage, should an opportunity arise later. Her life became defined by the needs of others. The economic aspect was also significant. This caregiving work was almost invariably unpaid. While her married siblings might contribute financially from a distance, the unmarried sister living in the household and providing round-the-clock care often did so without any direct compensation, further entrenching her financial dependence. Her labor, though essential to the family's well-being, was devalued because it was performed within the domestic sphere and by an unmarried woman. It was seen as her duty or her natural role, rather than as work deserving of recognition or remuneration. The subtle shaming lay in the implication that if she did not willingly or cheerfully accept this role, she was selfish or undutiful. To express a desire for her own life, to seek employment outside the home, or to pursue personal interests could be met with disapproval or guilt-tripping from family members. She was made to feel that her primary purpose, in the absence of her own marriage and children, was to serve the needs of her extended family. This expectation could last for decades, consuming the best years of her life. When her parents passed away, or when her nieces and nephews grew up, she might find herself middle-aged or elderly, with no independent means of support, no pension, and no family of her own to care for her in her old age. The pressure to become the family caregiver was a powerful force that shaped the lives of countless unmarried women. It limited their autonomy, restricted their horizons, and often led to lives of quiet sacrifice and unacknowledged labor. It was a form of shaming that operated through love and obligation, making it particularly difficult to resist, and it underscored the societal belief that an unmarried woman's life was inherently less important and less deserving of personal fulfillment than that of a married woman. Number 5. Locked out. Social events and opportunities denied. Imagine a world where your social life and even your opportunities for personal growth were curtailed simply because you did not have a husband by your side. For unmarried women in many historical contexts, particularly from the 17th century through the Victorian era and into the early 20th century, social exclusion was a common experience. Being single, especially beyond a certain age, often meant being left out of important social gatherings, considered an awkward presence in a society structured around couples, and subtly or overtly denied participation in aspects of community life that were readily available to married women. This exclusion served as a potent, if often unspoken, shaming tactic, reinforcing the idea that an unmarried woman was incomplete or somehow peripheral to mainstream society. Social events in many past eras, especially among the middle and upper classes, were heavily centered on couples. Dinner parties, balls, formal receptions, and even informal evening gatherings often required an equal number of men and women, with seating arrangements and dance cards meticulously planned. An unmarried woman, particularly one without a readily available male escort, such as a brother or father, could find herself in an awkward position. Hostesses might be reluctant to invite her, fearing she would unbalance the numbers or be seen as a wallflower, a pitiable figure left without a partner. To be consistently omitted from guest lists or to attend events only to feel like an outsider was a clear message about her perceived social value. The nature of conversation and social interaction also often favored married women. Discussions might revolve around husbands, children, and household management, topics in which an unmarried woman might feel she had little to contribute or was not qualified to speak. She could be relegated to the fringes of conversations, her opinions on broader matters perhaps given less weight because she lacked the status conferred by marriage. This could be incredibly isolating, making her feel invisible or irrelevant even when she was physically present. Beyond purely social gatherings, opportunities for influence or participation in community affairs were also often limited for unmarried women. While married women, particularly those of a certain social standing, might wield informal power through their husbands or engage in charitable work deemed appropriate for their station. Unmarried women often had fewer avenues for public engagement. They might be seen as lacking the maturity or stability that marriage supposedly conferred, and therefore less suited for roles that involve decision-making or public representation. Even within female-dominated spheres of activity, the shaming aspect of this exclusion was often subtle but pervasive. It was not necessarily through outright insults, but through a consistent pattern of being overlooked, an underlying assumption that her presence was not essential or even slightly problematic. This could chip away at a woman's confidence and sense of belonging. The message was that society was built for pairs, and those who were single were, in a sense, failing to fit the mold. This pressure was particularly acute in smaller communities where social life was tightly knit and exclusion was more keenly felt. Furthermore, the lack of social opportunities also limited an unmarried woman's chances of meeting potential partners, creating a vicious cycle. If she was not invited to events where she might encounter eligible men, her chances of marrying diminished, further solidifying her status as single and making her more likely to be excluded in the future. For women who genuinely desired marriage, this social lockout could be a source of deep frustration and sadness. For those who were content with their single status, it was still a constant reminder that society did not fully accept or accommodate them as they were. This quiet, persistent social sidelining was a powerful way to reinforce the idea that an unmarried woman was somehow on the margins, waiting for her real life as a wife to begin. Number 4. Whispers and warnings. Folklore that painted single women as unlucky or dangerous. Imagine living in a world where popular beliefs and old wives' tales cast unmarried women, especially older ones, in a suspicious or even sinister light. Throughout history, folklore, superstitions, and local legends often served as powerful informal mechanisms of social control, and unmarried women were sometimes the subjects of tales that portrayed them as unlucky sources of misfortune, or in extreme cases, associated with malevolent forces like witchcraft. These cultural narratives, passed down through generations, contributed to an atmosphere of mistrust or pity surrounding single women, subtly shaming them and reinforcing the idea that their unmarried state was unnatural or undesirable. In many folk traditions, there was an underlying belief in a natural order, and for women, this order typically involved marriage and childbearing. A woman who remained unmarried beyond a certain age could be seen as disrupting this order, making her an anomaly. Anomalies in folklore often attract suspicion or are associated with bad luck. For example, there were superstitions in some communities that an old maid encountered first thing in the morning could bring bad luck for the day, or that her presence at certain events, like weddings or christenings, might cast a shadow over the proceedings. These beliefs, however irrational, could lead to social avoidance and make unmarried women feel unwelcome or like walking omens. The association of older single women with witchcraft is perhaps the most extreme and horrifying example of this phenomenon, particularly prominent during the witch hunts of early modern Europe and colonial America. While not all accused witches were unmarried, a significant portion were widows or spinsters, often older, poor, and living on the fringes of society. Their independence, their knowledge of herbs, often used for healing, their sometimes eccentric behavior, or simply their lack of a male protector in a patriarchal society could make them targets for suspicion when unexplained misfortunes like illness, crop failure, or livestock death occurred. The stereotype of the old hag witch, often depicted as a solitary, embittered woman, drew on existing societal anxieties about women who lived outside the conventional family structure. To be labeled a witch was the ultimate form of shaming and marginalization, often with fatal consequences. Even short of witchcraft accusations, folklore could paint unmarried women in unflattering or pitiable ways. There were numerous rhymes, proverbs, and stories about the sad fate of the old maid, often emphasizing her loneliness, her supposed desperation for a husband, or her eccentricities. Children might chant taunting rhymes about local unmarried women. These cultural products, while sometimes seemingly harmless, contributed to a collective image of the spinster as a figure to be either avoided, pitied, or mocked. They taught young girls that failing to marry could lead to a lonely and stigmatized old age. The shaming inherent in these folk beliefs was powerful because it was often deeply ingrained and unquestioned, part of the cultural air people breathed. It was not official doctrine or law, but rather a set of shared anxieties and prejudices expressed through story and superstition. For an unmarried woman, knowing that such beliefs circulated within her community could be deeply unsettling. Could make her self-conscious, wary of how her actions might be interpreted, and aware that some might view her not just as a person, but as a symbol of something negative or out of place. These whispers and warnings, woven into the fabric of everyday life, served as a constant, subtle pressure to conform to the marital norm, lest one become the subject of dark rumors or cautionary tales. It was a way for society to reinforce its values by casting those who deviated from them in a negative and sometimes dangerous light. Number 3. The marriage mandate. Religious teachings that left no room for singleness. Imagine being told from the pulpit and through revered texts that the primary, if not sole, path to righteousness and fulfillment for a woman was through marriage and motherhood. For centuries, in many Western societies heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian traditions, religious teachings often emphasized marriage as a divine institution and the expected norm for adult life. While celibacy might be revered in specific, limited contexts like monastic orders, for the average laywoman remaining unmarried could be implicitly or explicitly framed as falling short of a divine plan, a failure to fulfill her God-given purpose. This religious framing of marriage as a mandate contributed significantly to the shaming of unmarried women. Many interpretations of religious texts historically highlighted passages that seemed to promote marriage and procreation as primary duties. Eve was created as a companion for Adam. Injunctions to be fruitful and multiply were taken seriously. Sermons, theological writings, and religious advice, literature often extolled the virtues of marriage as the proper state for women, providing them with protection, purpose, and a legitimate outlet for their sexuality, which outside of marriage was heavily condemned. A woman's piety was often judged by her successful management of a Christian household and her raising of godly children. Within this framework, where did an unmarried woman fit? Often, she did not fit comfortably. While compassion might be extended, there was frequently an underlying sense that her state was less than ideal, perhaps even a sign of some personal lack or a misfortune to be borne with resignation. Prayers might be offered for unmarried women to find suitable husbands, reinforcing the idea that marriage was the desired and blessed outcome. Some religious traditions viewed the unmarried state with suspicion, associating it with potential temptation or idleness if the woman was not otherwise virtuously occupied in a way sanctioned by the church, such as charitable works. The shaming aspect could be subtle. It was not always a direct condemnation of single women, but rather an overwhelming emphasis on the sanctity and necessity of marriage that, by omission or comparison, devalued singleness. If marriage was constantly upheld as the ideal, then not being married could easily be perceived as being less than ideal, less blessed, or somehow incomplete in the eyes of God and the religious community. This could lead to a profound sense of spiritual inadequacy for unmarried women who were devout believers. They might question their own faith or worthiness if they remained single, especially if they desired marriage but had not found a partner. Furthermore, the social life of many communities revolved around the church, and here too the emphasis on family units could leave single women feeling marginalized. Church events, support networks, and even seating arrangements might be geared towards families and couples. An unmarried woman might feel like an appendage, or her contributions to church life might be valued less than those of married women who were raising the next generation of the faithful. While some religious traditions did offer alternative paths for women, such as becoming a nun, this was a specific calling not available or desired by all. For the majority of unmarried women outside such religious orders, the dominant religious narrative often left them in a spiritual no man's land. They were expected to be chaste and pious, yet their very state of singleness could be seen as a deviation from the norm that God had supposedly ordained for most of humanity. This religious pressure added another heavy layer to the societal expectation to marry, framing it not just as a social or economic necessity, but as a moral and spiritual imperative. To remain unmarried was, in this context, to risk not only social disapproval, but also the subtle implication of being out of step with divine will. Number 2. Limited choices. The narrow path of acceptable female occupations. Imagine a world where your ability to support yourself, to have a career, or to achieve any measure of financial independence was so severely restricted that marriage seemed not just a desirable option, but an absolute economic necessity. For a vast majority of women throughout much of history, the range of acceptable and available occupations was incredibly narrow. This lack of economic opportunity was a powerful indirect shaming tactic that pushed women towards marriage, as remaining single often meant a life of dependency or dire poverty. The implicit message was that a woman's primary economic role was to be supported by a husband, and failing to secure one meant facing a bleak financial future. For centuries, professions in law, medicine, beyond midwifery or nursing in limited contexts, academia, business ownership, and most skilled trades were almost exclusively male domain. Women were largely barred from higher education, apprenticeships, and guilds that would have allowed them to acquire marketable skills and earn a decent living. The work that was available to women was typically low status, low paid, and often an extension of domestic duties. These included roles such as domestic servant, governess, seamstress, laundress, or, with the advent of industrialization, factory worker in textile mills or other similar industries. Even within these limited fields, unmarried women often faced disadvantages. Governess, for example, might be respectably employed, but poorly paid living in a socially ambiguous position within a wealthy household, neither family nor servant. Her position was often precarious, dependent on the goodwill of her employers and the continued need for her services. Seamstresses and laundresses often worked long hours for pitiful wages, struggling to make ends meet. Factory work was arduous and often dangerous, with little prospect for advancement. The societal expectation was that if a woman worked, it was ideally temporary, a prelude to marriage or due to unfortunate circumstances like widowhood or the inability of a male relative to support her. For an unmarried woman who needed to support herself indefinitely, the options were grim. She was often seen as an object of pity, or sometimes suspicion, if she managed to achieve a degree of independence that seemed unfeminine. The very idea of a woman pursuing a career in the modern sense was largely unthinkable for most. This economic vulnerability served as a constant pressure to marry. Marriage, for all its potential limitations on a woman's autonomy, at least offered the prospect of financial support from a husband. Even if a marriage was unhappy, it often provided a level of economic security that was difficult for a single woman to achieve on her own. The shaming aspect came from the societal judgment that a woman who could not catch a husband to provide for her was somehow failing. Her struggle to survive economically on her own could be seen not as a result of systemic limitations, but as a personal inadequacy. Furthermore, the few respectable paths for unmarried women, like becoming a teacher, often with the requirement to resign upon marriage, or a nurse, still paid less than comparable male roles and offered limited long-term security. The surplus women of the 19th century, outnumbering men in some areas due to war or emigration, faced particular hardship, with fierce competition for the few available jobs and for potential husbands. Constant economic insecurity experienced by so many unmarried women was a powerful shaming mechanism. It relentlessly underscored their dependence and reinforced the message that their primary value and their best hope for a stable life lay in finding a husband, not in forging their own independent path. The system was structured to make singleness an economically unviable and therefore socially undesirable state for most women. Number 1. The family disappointment, bearing the weight of unfulfilled expectations. Imagine carrying the unspoken or sometimes overtly expressed disappointment of your entire family, simply because you had not married. For many women in past societies, remaining single was not just a personal matter, but was perceived as a failure that reflected on her entire family, bringing with it a heavy burden of guilt, shame, and the constant pressure of unfulfilled expectations. This familial pressure, deeply rooted in social and economic concerns, was perhaps one of the most pervasive and emotionally damaging forms of spinster shaming. From a young age, girls were often groomed for marriage. Their education, upbringing, and social activities were frequently directed towards making them desirable wives. A daughter's successful marriage could be a source of significant pride and social standing for a family. Could mean advantageous alliances with other families, economic benefits, and the assurance of grandchildren to carry on the family line. Conversely, a daughter who remained unmarried, especially if she was perceived as being on the shelf or past the typical marrying age, could become a source of anxiety, embarrassment, or even perceived shame for her parents and siblings. Parents might worry about who would care for an unmarried daughter in her old age, especially if they themselves were not wealthy. There was also the social stigma. In communities where marriage was the norm, having an unmarried adult daughter at home could lead to gossip and speculation. Was she too picky? Was there something wrong with her? Was the family unable to provide an adequate dowry or attract suitable suitors? These questions, whether spoken or implied, placed immense pressure on both the woman and her family. The disappointment could manifest in various ways. There might be constant anxious inquiries from parents about her prospects, relentless matchmaking attempts with often unsuitable candidates, or comparisons with other young women who had successfully married. Family gatherings could become ordeals, with relatives offering unsolicited advice or pitying glances. In some cases, an unmarried daughter might be made to feel like a burden, an extra mouth to feed, who was not fulfilling her expected role of establishing her own household. The emotional toll of feeling like a disappointment to loved ones could be immense, leading to feelings of inadequacy, loneliness, and a diminished sense of self-worth. This pressure was not always malicious. It often stemmed from genuine concern and adherence to deeply ingrained societal norms. Parents wanted their daughters to be secure and happy, and in their will-do, marriage was the primary, if not only path to achieving that. However, the methods used to push daughters towards marriage could be deeply shaming. Constant implication that her current state was unsatisfactory, that she was somehow incomplete or failing without a husband, was a heavy weight to bear. For the woman herself, internalizing this sense of being a family disappointment could shape her entire life. She might feel compelled to marry someone she was not truly compatible with, simply to escape the pressure and stigma. Or if she remained single, she might carry a lifelong sense of having let her family down, a feeling that could overshadow any personal achievements or contentment she found in other areas of her life. This deep-seated familial expectation, and the shame associated with not meeting it, was a powerful force that underscored the societal belief that a woman's ultimate validation came through marriage, and that to remain a spinster was to fall short not only in her own life, but also in her duty to her family.